Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the 1000-Year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to follow. When attempting to figure out who the strongest Sternritter are, there is one particular character, for me at least, who often sticks out as the problem child, who theoretically should be easy to place as maybe the strongest of them all, but in reality we simply don't get to see enough from them to be able to make a truly educated, definitive statement of any kind. Of course, I'm referring to not just any Sternritter, nor even a member of Yhwach's private guard, the upper echelon, the Schutzstaffel, but in fact the Sternritter Grandmaster himself, Sternritter B the Balance, Jugram Haschwalth, and the second most prominent villain of the entire final arc of Bleach. Look, there's no denying Haschwalth's incredible power, I'm not here to do that. But you'd be forgiven for thinking, with a massive military organisation like the Vandenreich which operates within such a well-defined hierarchy, that Haschwalth may very well be the strongest Sternritter of the bunch, considering his place at the head of the table, both figuratively and literally. Yhwach even calls him his first son. But in actuality, Haschwalth's position is much more nuanced than that, and it simply isn't that clear-cut. For starters, there are several other high-ranking Sternritter from who we've seen a lot more in regards to their combat capabilities, and for who their own unique abilities are apparently just as busted, if not more so, than Haschwalth's, the likes of Lil Barrow and Gerard Valkyrie, of course, who muddy the waters greatly. And so, as always with these discussions, the reality is deeper than it first appears. And I think asking whether or not Haschwalth is definitively the strongest Sternritter isn't the right question for this video. Instead, we need to cultivate a picture of how strong he is in general first, to really get an idea of where this character stands overall, and understand what the big, crucial problem is with Haschwalth when it comes to trying to mete out this kind of discourse. In a way, this is going to be a similar video to the one we made fairly recently about Ulquiorra's Segunda Etapa, and the major problem that form faced too, when it came to determining just how strong it really was. Haschwalth struggles with a similar roadblock that makes understanding him harder than it needed to be. Well, in today's video, I want to take a look at the character of Jugram Haschwalth, a man who, despite being the second in command of the final arc's entire enemy force, it feels is fairly easy to overlook, not just in regards to the narrative, but in regards to how strong he really is and what he's capable of, especially considering the company he keeps, and how so many of his closest contemporaries are considered many of the strongest, most broken characters in all of Bleach. Can Haschwalth compete, or do we simply need to know more? Let's find out. Before we get started on the video, guys, consider hitting subscribe down below if you enjoyed it. It really does help, and I really do appreciate it. And check out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games, where we're trying to hit 15,000 subs by the end of the year. We're only a few hundred away, and so if you want to be a part of that final push to get us to that next major milestone, again, I really would appreciate it. So, what do we really know about how strong Jugram Haschwalth is? He's definitely a strange character who occupies an equally weird space within the Bleach story. Despite being the secondary main villain of the entire final arc and appearing in a huge number of chapters throughout the arc, in comparison with not just the Sternritter but even the majority of the Espada too, in respect to the Irankar arc, it feels like we know very little of what Haschwalth is truly capable of in battle. And that, in itself, feels like it stems from the sad fact that, well, Haschwalth does very little throughout the arc despite his screen time, and much of his reported strength comes either via hearsay or through scant flashes and glimpses at the Grandmaster's genuine strength. As a special Quincy, and the other half of Yhwach born once every 200 years, Haschwalth wasn't born with the natural Quincy ability to gather reishi from his surroundings. Instead, he gives power, and can even amplify the growth of his fellow Quincy simply by being around them for an extended period of time. While the second Quincy invasion goes some way to showing us that Haschwalth appears to have eventually learned how to dominate and control reishi, the fact is that it doesn't come naturally to him like it should. And, interestingly, unlike where Yhwach is concerned, it feels like Kubo never explores the benefits of being a special Quincy with Haschwalth. For example, Yuha has the ability to freely give and take power, which is absurdly strong, allowing him to restore his own power at will and even steal and redistribute power, to such a degree that power itself became a new metric as of the Thousand Year Blood War arc. Haschwalth doesn't seem to have any of that. Despite being a so-called special Quincy and being the other half of Yuha, Haschwalth certainly seems to be more, well, normal than the Quincy King, where Yuha has to keep absorbing and redistributing souls in order to function. That doesn't seem to be the case with Haschwalth at all. Much like his control of the Almighty, Haschwalth's version of this power seems to be a very watered-down version of what Yuha has access to, in regards to both the benefits and the disadvantages. What we do know about Haschwalth, though, is his shrift, the balance, and despite being one of the more abstract and nebulous abilities of the series, it is also one of the strongest by far. At its most basic level, the balance allows Haschwalth to take any good fortune that occurs for any targets within his vicinity and redistribute it back upon them as misfortune. We see a few examples of this in the story. When Kangdu uses the iron to successfully block Haschwalth's blade, that is considered good fortune on Kangdu's part. Haschwalth then takes that good fortune, uses the balance to redistribute it as misfortune, and makes it so that he's capable of cleaving through Kangdu's body with his next hit. Although I guess, in technical terms, it wouldn't be that Haschwalth became stronger, it would either be that Kangdu's iron became weaker, or he simply was unlucky this time. Either way, it's misfortune for Kangdu so much as it is good fortune for Haschwalth. In the anime, the Zero Division collectively experiences a vast quantity of good fortune when Yuha chooses to leave them be to face Ichibei instead. Haschwalth takes this huge amount of good fortune and turns it into misfortune for the Zero Division, using it to destroy the Cage of Life. It's an incredibly weird power, and this is another intriguing instance of this power being used. In this instance, Haschwalth is able to, I guess, collect that aura of misfortune that he gathers from the Zero Division, the individuals that make up the Zero Division, and dispense it to a different target, this time being the Cage of Life. It's an incredibly weird power, and might be one such ability that is frankly too broken to exist in Bleach without really screwing things up. It feels like the only way to defeat Haschwalth is to kill him in a single hit before the balance can even activate, or to, rob him of all of his powers and life force. The most absurd example of the balance, and the chain reaction it can inspire, comes during Haschwalth's battle with Uryu. Uryu, seriously injured and almost defeated, uses his shrift, the antithesis, to reverse his and Haschwalth's positions, completely ridding himself of any injury, while doling out massive damage to Haschwalth instead. Of course, Haschwalth's the balance kicks in to counter this situation, but it does so twofold. As Uryu experienced a vast quantity of good fortune in being able to wound Haschwalth so greatly via the antithesis, Haschwalth immediately injures Uryu in the same way, converting that good fortune into misfortune. But there is another layer to contend with as well. In this fight, Haschwalth is wielding his Frund shield, a special bespoke shield that absorbs any misfortune dealt to Haschwalth himself specifically, before redirecting it back at his foe. So, on top of redirecting the good fortune Uryu experienced, Haschwalth's Frund shield collects the misfortune Haschwalth himself experienced by being injured, and then also rains that down upon Uryu as an additional wave of injury. Yeah, it's pretty stupid, and I don't really know what Kubo was on when he came up with it. Without a doubt, this is one of the dumbest abilities in Bleach, and I mean that in both a good and a bad way, to be honest. It essentially means that should Haschwalth survive an encounter, he has the ultimate reflector ability. But more than that, he's able to affect those in his vicinity, even if they haven't directly engaged him yet. Of course, as the other side of the scale with Yuha, Haschwalth also has access to the Almighty, but on a much lesser scale. Basically, once night falls and Yhwach sleeps, his power transfers to Haschwalth, and presumably Yhwach gains access to the balance, though we never see that, and Haschwalth is capable of seeing the future. However, unlike Yhwach, Haschwalth can't change the future in any way, so in that sense it is similar to Haschwalth's ability to give power, in that it's basically just a worse, watered-down version of what Yhwach can do. And look, that's part of the problem with Haschwalth, and we'll get into this in a moment, but Haschwalth feels like a melting pot of several different, underdeveloped abilities that kind of collectively rob him of his identity. Then there's Haschwalth's overall combat capability, which might be the most underserved part of this character's repertoire. Due to possessing no inherent skill as a Quincy, Haschwalth instead trained day in, day out with the blade, becoming a swords master in every sense of the word. Yes, Haschwalth cuts Tensa Zangetsu in two with a single strike, which is cool, but how do we know he isn't using the balance in this moment? How can we attribute it solely to his skill with the sword? The balance might have taken Yhwach leaving Ichigo alive as good fortune for the hero, and so Haschwalth redistributed it back upon him as misfortune in cutting his sword in half. Remember, Haschwalth wasn't able to innately cut through Kangdu's the Iron with his base amount of power. In his final battle with Uryu, we can assume that Uryu ends up in such a bad state, due to Haschwalth completely overwhelming him with his blade, but again, we simply have no idea, considering how much of that fight takes place off-screen. And to be honest, that segues us nicely into the big problem with Haschwalth and trying to figure out how strong he actually is in the grand scheme of things. We don't really see him do anything in a way that truly matters. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at every instance of Haschwalth fighting in the Thousand Year Blood War arc. Haschwalth spends much of the arc either by Yhwach's side, or, well, actually that's about it. He's used almost exclusively as a means of giving the reader exposition, whether that's on Quincy lore, Yhwach himself, or otherwise. At least initially, the early signs of any fights he might be involved in are mostly just teases. Him slicing Tensa Zangetsu in half, or using his shrift to kill Kangdu and BG9, for example. Even his showdown with Kyoraku and Nanao involves next to no actual fighting, and instead he spends almost the entire time standing behind a barrier. Now, that scenario gives us at least some look at Haschwalth's innate Quincy abilities in use, as he peels away the reishi of Nanao's barrier to eventually break through it. So that's something. But the moment Haschwalth looks ready to take things seriously, and even use his blade, he's called away from the scene. And I get it, you want to hype up the second in command, you want to tease his powers and abilities, but the reality is, Haschwalth never ends up in a scenario where we the reader get a good look and feel of what he can do. For starters, strangely, Haschwalth doesn't have a single proper fight against a Shinigami opponent, which also serves to make him feel isolated, not just from the wider conflict, but from the ability to gauge his true power. His first actual fight is against Basby, and while I think this is a great little duel, it's really more a vehicle for the lore than anything else, a means to show us the character backstory and the history of the Vandenreich. Not only that, but Haschwalth absolutely destroys Basby, and barely breaks a sweat doing so. Things start out fairly evenly, with the two of them tangling in close quarters, and Basby even managing to graze Haschwalth with a well-placed burner finger. But all of this choreography is simply in service of allowing Haschwalth to draw his sword. By the time the Grandmaster has unsheathed his blade, there's no going back, and Basby doesn't stand a chance. So you might be thinking, well, that's good, right? The fact that Haschwalth utterly dominates Basby, who himself is a powerful Sternritter, shows us how strong Haschwalth really is. And to some extent, yes, that's true. Over the course of their brief contest, it always feels as though Haschwalth is pulling back. He's swift, he's agile, he's capable of leaping around an entire room to avoid Basby's strikes. When it comes to attacking, Haschwalth appears to be very deliberate, but every hit counts in an enormous way. He catches Basby's arrow in his bare hand before slashing him across the stomach. The sheer force of Haschwalth's sword swing is enough to send Basby blasting through a nearby wall, and then later Haschwalth cuts off Basby's arm. At this point, though, seemingly still pulling his punches, doing everything he can to stop the fight without killing his former friend. In the end, though, as Basby unleashes his ultimate ability, Haschwalth finally puts him down with one last swing. And again, you can see that ultimately all Haschwalth needed to win was, 3 sword swings? After Basby's initial burner finger, Haschwalth is never struck again. And so, to go back to our earlier point, doesn't this prove how powerful Haschwalth really is? Well, it does and it doesn't. Because funnily enough, Basby also never experiences a true fight against a Shinigami. His showdown with Hitsugaya is also a one-sided stomp in Basby's favour, as Hitsugaya hasn't yet retrieved his bankai. Not only that, but when Basby fights Haschwalth, he's recently been heavily weakened as a result of being struck by the Owl's Valen. So unfortunately things just aren't so black and white. Yes, Haschwalth is clearly stronger than Basby, no one's debating that, and is a skilled swordsman, but that's about all we know. Anything more granular than that is frankly off the table. And then things get even muddier when Haschwalth faces off with Uryu at the end of the arc. I've gone on record before saying this is definitely Varvelt's worst fight and absolutely one of the worst fights of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, and it shows. In what's become something of a trend for Haschwalth now, virtually everything of note he does happens off-screen in this fight. Every time we cut back to the battle, Uryu is looking worse for wear, and then we transition away again just as someone prepares to attack. Whether that's Haschwalth swinging his sword at Uryu, which occurs twice as a transition, or him launching an arc of energy at his enemy, the version of this fight in the manga doesn't really want to show us anything. All we can glean from this is that Haschwalth completely destroys Uryu from start to finish, once again, and at some point manifested his front shield for some reason, even though he was clearly winning the fight with no problem. But honestly, based on what we know nowadays, and what the anime has elected to include, this beatdown by Haschwalth doesn't seem to make much sense anymore. Unless again he really is just that much more powerful than even Uryu, who at this point in the anime is easily killing members of the Zero Division. Again, I've said it before, but I'd be amazed if Haschwalth's battle with Uryu isn't substantially changed in the anime. And I think, rather than continuously cut away, we will actually see the fight play out. And I have a hunch that Uryu, while he may still lose, will put up much more of a fight than the manga would lead you to believe. But that's total speculation. Either way, in the manga, their fight does nothing to help us truly understand how strong Haschwalth is, because in the manga, Uryu also hasn't done a damn thing. So Haschwalth, without having a true Shinigami opponent to bounce his strength off of, utterly destroys two Quincy, who, though powerful, don't have any real fights of their own in the arc either, and in fights that can only generously be called a fight at best. You're starting to see the problem here. It's a really weird character. Really, the only concrete element we have to go on regarding Haschwalth is his shrift. We know, thankfully, exactly what the balance does, how it works, and yes, how utterly busted it is. But aside from that, he's an expert swordsman, I guess, fighting battles with enemies who don't use swords. I know Haschwalth is powerful, and so do you, but he's such a weird character who, despite his narrative prominence, exists completely outside the norm in the Bleach narrative. And for a character of such renown, his fights are odd, lacking, and don't present what feels like anywhere close to a full picture of this character's strength. Interestingly though, the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime has given Haschwalth a new battle, and for the first time ever it's a fight that goes terribly for him. In his duel with Karinji Tenjiro, Haschwalth wields his front shield, but for whatever reason doesn't seem to utilise the balance even once. Instead, Tenjiro rapidly overwhelms him with sword strikes before disarming him and actually overpowering Haschwalth to the point of casting his shield aside. When it comes to their final clash, Tenjiro is victorious, cutting the Sternritter Grandmaster down in a single blow. I mean, what the hell am I supposed to take away from this? Of course, Haschwalth is later revived and empowered by the Auswählen, but exactly how much stronger did it make him? It would have been interesting to see him go up against Tenjiro again, perhaps, but instead, he doesn't fight anyone. I think his battle against Uryu in the anime to come will perhaps be the most telling of all. It'll give Kubo and the team a chance to truly define Haschwalth's power in a fight with a worthy opponent. I don't think it's too hard to imagine that Haschwalth, having had no skill as a Quincy from a young age, honed his sword fighting skills to near perfection. But it certainly would have been nice to actually see him use them in battle against another sword wielder. Hell, in the anime, Haschwalth almost exclusively combats Tenjiro with his shield for some reason. Maybe I've missed something, or maybe I'm just completely wrong. I'd love to get your thoughts, but this is why I think it's genuinely difficult, if not totally impossible, to really gauge Haschwalth's power overall. Like I said, he occupies a very unusual spot among the Bleach power hierarchy, and we simply don't have a good means of truly understanding where he stands. Both of Haschwalth's main fights are against less than ideal enemies in less than ideal scenarios, where there's almost always some kind of mitigating factor, and he wins by a mile, which doesn't paint a straightforward or even useful picture. Again, all we can say with absolute certainty is that the balance is totally broken, but we knew that already. Alright everyone, that's it for today's video. As always, thank you so very much for watching, and I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Am I right about Haschwalth and how we can gauge his power level, or how we can't gauge his power level more accurately? Do you think I'm right, or am I off base here? Is there more that we know about this character that can be used? Is there more to him than meets the eye? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I'd absolutely love to hear them. How strong do you think Haschwalth is overall based on what we do get to see in the manga? Is he the strongest Sternritter of the bunch when you take everything into account and take a holistic look at each individual character? Personally, I'm not sure he is, even though the balance itself is a top tier broken power. But it doesn't seem to me like Haschwalth can really pick up the slack in ways characters like Lille Barrow or Gerard Valkyrie can, who are much more all-encompassing in terms of their strength. Alright everyone, once again, thank you very much for watching. Remember to hit subscribe down below if you haven't done already. Consider checking out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games, and a massive thank you goes out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without who I simply wouldn't be able to do this, so your support does mean the absolute world, and it is greatly, greatly appreciated. Alright guys, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.